time now to look at the week's events in federal politics in the wake of Monday's federal election and with the news about the Meng Wanzhou case. Joining me now are three journalists and avid Ottawa watchers. Bob Fife is the Ottawa bureau chief for the Globe and Mail. Mia Rabson is a parliamentary reporter with the Canadian Press. And Nigaan Sinclair is an author and a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. All three of you, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, Bob Fife, we have to start with you because obviously you and your colleague Steve Chase at the Globe and Mail have been following this Meng Wanzhou story and the Canada-China relations in great detail for years now. We have this deferred prosecution agreement. What does it mean for the fate of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig imprisoned in China now for more than 1,000 days?
Well, I think we should be optimistic that now that they have a deferred prosecution agreement, that Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor will now be able to be free. Or how soon that is going to happen, it's difficult to say, Martin. I've heard people say it's possible that they could be freed by the end of October. Other people saying it might be a bit longer. China has done this before with the Garretts when they conducted hostage diplomacy, really, and it took them a couple months before they released the Garrett. So I think we have to be, our best wishes is hoping that it can happen very soon, but it could still be a couple of months. But I think it's clear that they are going to be freed, and that's got to be enormous relief to the families. Okay, what about politically? A relief to the Trudeau government? It's a huge relief to the Trudeau government. They have been trying since December 2018, when those two men were first arrested on trumped-up spying charges, to get them released. And it wasn't just that. I mean, China had put on some punishing trade sanctions against us. It basically froze us out. And but the worst of obviously were the conditions that these two men faced in being put in Chinese prisons with lights on 24/7, while Miss Meng lived in a $14 million mansion in Vancouver. Now, you know, they've been working very hard in the final days of the Trump administration. The U.S. Justice Department tried to get a deferred prosecution agreement with Miss Meng. She refused to do so because they wanted her to plead guilty. In April of this year, our ambassador to China, Dominic Barton, had gone to Washington and met everybody to try to get the process going. And just in the last few weeks, the U.S. Justice Department resumed negotiations, and they've got a deferred prosecution agreement, one in which he doesn't have to plead guilty, but there are other conditions to it. All of this means that, from the Canadian government's point of view, the Biden administration has really delivered for Canada, and let's hope that those two men are out soon. Mia, I mean, following the election campaign, this was actually a central. It was a key plank in the Conservatives' critique of the Liberal or the Trudeau government, saying that they've handled China affairs very badly, and one of the best examples was the two Michaels who are, you know, imprisoned in China as hostages, basically, of the Chinese regime there. How do you think this will play politically for the Trudeau Liberals?
Well, I'm certain that they're extremely relieved that this agreement is now in place. These negotiations that, as Bob mentioned, have been going on for quite some time, finally coming to some kind of conclusion, and maybe, hopefully, for the two Michaels, for Mr. Spavor, Mr. Kovrig's sake and their families, that this will result in their release. I don't think anyone's going to see this as a victory. I mean, these two men have been in prison in China for 1,000 days plus now. Anybody who would see this as a victory is probably not going to be well received. But it's also affected how the government's been able to handle China, because they had to take into account how the Canadians in prison in China would be treated, or how that might be affecting their case in every decision that they have made about China policy. Even the U.S., the new incoming ambassador, has said this week that the U.S. is waiting to see what Canada's China policy is, and all of that seems to have been a bit on hold because they didn't know what was going to happen in this particular case. So in some ways, this conclusion really just opens it up for Canada to start really thinking ahead on how it and its allies can work with its allies on China.
Nigaan, it makes me think of an expression, between the cup and the lips, there's often many spilled drops. We're still waiting for this all to come through, and some observers, even today, are suggesting that the Chinese government might hold out for, I don't know, more preferential treatment in terms of the Huawei 5G network. We've made it fairly clear that we're probably not interested in getting involved in the Huawei 5G network. Is there still a potential jeopardy to the Trudeau government and the Liberal government?
And also the fact that, during this federal election campaign, there was all these promises made to ban people for buying homes out in the west side of the West Coast. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is a kind of an ongoing challenge in the Canadian public around the relationship with China, and that certainly came out in the last federal election. Yeah. The challenge here is how fast can we secure the release of the two Michaels? Because the fact is, I mean, Bob is right. I mean, the situation, you can only imagine what it's like to live, breathe, and eat inside of a Chinese jail, while Meng Wanzhou is sitting in a $14 million land mansion in Vancouver. I mean, talk about the tale of two countries and the ways in which politics operates and the ways that diplomacy operates. And yeah, certainly President Biden and his administration deserves a bit of kudos for getting this moving, but this harkens back to the days of Donald Trump, and it shows that the impact of Donald Trump, as we're seeing with the Supreme Court in the United States, is beginning to take effect across the world, has deep waves that are going to continue throughout global politics for years to come. And, how will Canada handle this? Well, it's helpful to Trudeau in the opening days of his minority parliament to get a win on some kind of issue, some kind of major issue, because certainly the concern coming out of Afghanistan is that they don't have any role to play internationally, or they don't have any say and the ability to navigate those international issues. So this will certainly be helpful for the Trudeau Liberals moving forward. Okay,
let's talk about the federal election. It feels like weeks now, even although it's only been 4 days. But so much, we've already been pouring over the tea leaves. So much has been said. So much has been discussed. There's been a lot of analysis. But I want to give all three of you a chance to weigh in with your reactions. Generally, where do you think this leaves Justin Trudeau, and what should be on his to-do list as he said on election night that Canadians have told him it's time to get back to work. Bob?
Well, look, the Prime Minister's political capital, his political brand has been damaged and diminished by calling an election that really ended up with basically the same result. He's going to have to try to explain that to his caucus. Now, he's not in danger, I don't think, of any kind of caucus uprising. But he's probably not going to be around for the next election campaign. He has a couple of years now to burnish his credentials and to try to have something for the history books, which I think can be childcare and can be climate change. But he's going to have to be very careful, because if there's another weed charity scandal or another SNC Lavalin scandal, his caucus is not going to be there to buff him up, because there are already leadership contenders lying in wait. Chrystia Freeland, obviously, the finance minister and deputy prime minister. Mark Carney, I think, is still interested. And obviously people like Francois-Philippe Champagne and perhaps Melanie Joly. There are people there that will be willing to step in if Mr. Trudeau stumbles. So I think he should be focusing on now is trying to deal with the major issues facing the country, which is climate change, and obviously reconciliation with Canada's indigenous people. Those are very important things. And of course, the economy. I mean, the economy is really important once we get through what we hopefully will be the last dregs of this pandemic, and we can get the economy back in instead and people back working.
Okay, Mia, what should the Prime Minister's agenda be, and how does he come out of this election? Bob has alluded to the fact that he took a bruising, and politically he's expended a lot of political capital in calling the election and in barely squeaking through. What do you make of it?
Definitely. I mean, the Prime Minister went into this election. He wouldn't use the word majority, but everybody else knew that he was doing this because he thought he could get a majority. It was a chance for him to have the government that he wanted to have. Didn't end up that way. He's the one who said going into this election that Parliament was broken, that it wasn't working, and that there sort of needed a reset. And now he's going to have to figure out how to get Parliament to work, because essentially we have the same Parliament that might be even more divided than it was because of all of the sort of the outrage over the election and things that have happened in the last few weeks. So I think that's one of his first orders of business, is to figure out how he can get his government to work. Is he who he's going to get to support him? He's got a number of big issues coming. Obviously, the childcare deals that Bob mentioned. He wants to cement those with the provinces so that they are long done before the thought of any kind of future election. We've got a big climate change meeting coming up. The G20 is coming up this fall. Canada's sort of appearance and reputation globally has maybe also taken a beating in the last few years. So lots of things on his agenda, and he wants to go out of office on a high note. He's got to figure out a way to make all of those things work before he decides to take his, as some people call it, walk in the snow.
It's interesting you should mention the childcare agreement, because going into the election, there were two notable outstanding provinces, conservative-run provinces that hadn't signed on to the childcare agreement. This week, we had both Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick and Premier Doug Ford in Ontario saying that they are working and they are interested in signing a childcare agreement with the federal government. Nigaan, I'm going to be more specific, because I think you and I mean, from where we were in the election and from where you are, reconciliation. People talked about reconciliation in this election. We went into the election with reconciliation being a huge issue. What happened to reconciliation in the election? What happened to, I know we haven't got the results from Elections Canada in terms of the breakdown of Indigenous voters, but what happened to the Indigenous vote in this election? What are your thoughts on that?
Just to reiterate what you were saying just a minute ago with Doug Ford, I mean, Doug Ford needs a win there. He's got an election reaching next year, so he needs a win, which is why he's moving towards a child care plan. Reconciliation. If anything was proven in this election was two things. First, that Justin Trudeau has a glass ceiling in which his approval rating will not break. And no matter how hard the Liberal Party will try, elements of Alberta, elements of the prairies, elements of even in Atlantic Canada are turning away or have reached enough of Justin Trudeau. And so the Liberals really have to take a look at the brand of their leader and whether that they have something moving forward. I'm not convinced that he's not going to be around for the next election, although it may certainly would show that I think if the Liberals want to move, they might want to move in a different direction. And the second is that Canadians won't vote for reconciliation. And Canadians are interested more in looking at the ways in which small ornamental areas of reconciliation operate during an election campaign. And an election campaign isn't the time in which we need to be discussing major issues involving Indigenous peoples, because frankly, no matter who's at the front of that equation, there is a very large segment and likely a majority of this country that will not vote for it, particularly in Quebec, particularly amongst the prairies. And so that's the challenge, is how do we then motivate Canada to incorporate what is the just and ethical and responsible thing to do, which is to incorporate Indigenous rights, to begin to co-govern, to return stolen land, much of which Canada is sitting upon, and to begin to have a conversation of what does that look like moving forward into the future. And what does that mean? Well, in the last federal parliament, the last minority government, which was the Liberals propped up by the NDP, the most work was done in history on Indigenous issues, meaning boil water advisories were tackled more than ever in history. Childcare was downloaded onto First Nations. Or child welfare, sorry. The issues of Indigenous languages were supported for the first time. So the fact is that we may be looking at a federal government that may work for Indigenous peoples, and this may be the time to have that conversation.
But it's interesting, but you say it's not electorally a winner for any party in the federal, given the numbers and all that.
On the election night coverage that I worked upon with another network, I was alongside the David Hurley, who's a one of the national poll people who work on polling. Anyway, so he works the Hurley Burley podcast, and he said that one of the things that when he goes door to door and he talks to everyday Canadians, that's not an issue that has any traction, that influences people in any way. It certainly is something that Trudeau wants to brand himself as, and maybe in the past government of Stephen Harper, in relation to Stephen Harper, may have gotten some Canadian support. But the fact is that Canadians are not interested in supporting that issue. And what they are interested in is very small, very ornamental things like Orange Shirt Day or memorializing unmarked graves. That's not reconciliation, by the way. That's treating people like human beings. True reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous rights, co-governing the country, and returning stolen land.
Okay. That's not a very encouraging observation, but I take your point. Okay. Let's look at another major thing that's come out of this election, and that is Erin O'Toole and where he stands. Obviously, they didn't have the results after having polled ahead of the Liberals for a part of the election campaign. They didn't get the results they wanted. They actually won the popular vote, but they lost seats. Bob, what is Erin O'Toole facing now? What are you watching for?
Well, I think he's in a lot of trouble. You know, he doesn't have the tools of patronage that Justin Trudeau will have to keep defeated MPs in line with the promise of some government appointment. He's got nothing to keep that caucus in line. And a lot of them are very, very unhappy with the way he conducted the campaign. They felt that he excluded them in some of the decisions that he made. And they are obviously deeply disappointed that they didn't do as well as Andrew Scheer did the last time. So he's got a real effort inside that caucus to try to pull them together to see if he can save his leadership. First of all, he's got to have his caucus behind him. And then in a year or so's time, he's going to face a leadership vote at a party convention. So he's got two things to get through. He's got to see if he can survive a caucus, and then he's got to see if he can survive a leadership review vote that is mandatory after an election campaign. It's going to be really, really tough because a lot of these people are already whispering in all of our ears about how unhappy they are. And I suspect that whispering is going to continue and continue. We've all seen what happens, whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives when they're in opposition. Their leaders can face a lot of nasty stuff from inside their caucus, and I suspect that's going to happen with him. You know, Pierre Poilievre and Jenny Byrne are leading the attack against Mr. O'Toole, and they're formidable characters. So we'll see what happens. I wouldn't put any money on Mr. O'Toole surviving.
Okay, well, I guess that's the question. Mia, we know that in 2 weeks' time, the Conservatives are going to have their first caucus meeting. Under the rules that they've adopted, what's Michael Chong's Reform Act, 20% of the caucus can trigger a leadership review if 20% of the caucus votes to have it happen. Do you think he's going to survive that first post?
Honestly, today I couldn't even predict that. Yeah. I mean, 2 years ago, when Andrew Scheer was sort of in the same position, the Conservatives felt that Justin Trudeau was entirely beatable. He, of course, had several scandals even during the election itself and problems. They thought that they could absolutely take him out, and they didn't do it. 2 weeks later, with all of the whisperings that went on, Andrew Scheer survived that vote. Yeah. But the people within the caucus, within the party that wanted him gone, within a few weeks of that, figured out how to get him to go. So it's possible that Erin O'Toole will survive that vote in 2 weeks, and still, you know, within a few months, they will figure out a way to push him out. He clearly knew that this was coming. Even on election night, he was sort of setting the ground for it. The very next day, talking about electoral policy review and sort of taking a look at what went wrong and acknowledging that this was not the outcome that they wanted. It really depends on how the people within that caucus feel that if he's taking responsibility. But the Conservatives are also in a little bit of a sort of identity crisis. Mr. O'Toole tried to bring them back to the center, and there's many who feel that he didn't have the mandate to do that based on his leadership campaign. So a lot of questions within the Conservative Party. I wouldn't be surprised if he does survive in 2 weeks, but I also wouldn't be surprised if they decide to take him out so that they can immediately get ready for whenever the next election happens.
Nigaan Sinclair, you've got a lot of Conservatives in your neck of the woods. There's a whole ring of Conservatives and solid blue country outside of Winnipeg. Your thoughts on what the Conservatives what Erin O'Toole may or may not be facing?
For any Conservatives that want to dump Erin O'Toole simply because he's, within 2 years of being elected as leader, ran a campaign where in many cases people, for the first time in really since the days of Stephen Harper, people were actually potentially talking about a Conservative minority government. Now, that didn't come to pass, but I can tell you this, 30 ridings in the country were within 2,000 votes. And that tells you that while Erin O'Toole did not make inroads in Quebec or perhaps Ontario, although I certainly would say that for ridings, per riding had increased, he did have headway in Atlantic Canada. And he also kept on to the vote in Alberta during a time in which Jason Kenney was so deeply criticized, and the Conservative brand is the worst it's ever been. I mean, he lost in some ridings in Alberta 20 to 30%, which just tells you how firm and how landslide those elections are in Alberta, and he still came out with solid victories across Alberta by moving the party to the center. I think we need to remind Conservatives that Andrew Scheer and Stephen Harper have done such a impact on the Conservative Party in central Canada that if they ever want to make inroads in Ontario and Quebec, they need some kind of different direction. Erin O'Toole tried that different direction. 2 years is not enough of a time period in which you can make an impact, but you can see that there were elements of that impact potentially occurring. I mean, Francois Legault endorsed the Conservative Party. I mean, do we think that that's not going to have some kind of impact into the future? And if Conservatives want to imagine and go back to the days of the Reform Party and go back to someone like Pierre Poilievre, which is going to just further divide Canadians and continue to look as though it's a prairie party, is just not going to give them a government in the future.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to have to wrap up. Something tells me we will be revisiting the party fortunes of all of the parties coming out of this election. I want to thank all three of you for taking the time, and I think we can have take a breath now after the election coverage. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.